Many thanks for your interest in this topic, in the topic of my research, and also my sincere gratefulness goes to the DUAG, Deutsche Ukrainische Akademische Gesellschaft, and to the Embassy of Ukraine who organized this series of lectures devoted to the critical topic of Ukrainian science and Ukrainian history. Also, I am particularly thankful to Dr. Olesa Lazarenko, who personally invited me to this program. And of course, I'm thankful to Marta Logwin, Ukrainian museum scholar, who kindly agreed to moderate today's lecture and today's discussion. I will start with the brief outline of my project, the title of which you can see on the screen. So, the project Reflexive and Ethical Mind, Decolonial Dispositions of Islamic and Asian Heritage Museums in Germany, Switzerland, and Poland, that was carried out in 2022-2024 at the Department of Modern Art History, or it's also called Art History as Cultural History, of Professor Dr. Benedict Savoy in the Institute of Art Studies and Historical Urbanistic of the Technical University in Berlin. The recent decades witnessed museums self-recasting as active agents of social change. Pushed by academic museology, political and social activism, many museums of the so-called West have become increasingly self-reflexive. The growing knowledge on the history of colonialism and its global legacy prompted curators to decolonial rethinking of collections. The museum's decolonial turn proved to be an ethical turn, promoting the values of justice and addressing inequalities of power and knowledge deeply rooted within the history of Western colonialism and wider Western modernity. One of the key questions driving the decolonial turn was formulated by Karine Ayelet-Durand, director of Museum of Ethnography of Geneva. I quote, "How can museums rehabilitate their use of collections, their programming, and exhibitions while continuing to exploit heritage still bearing witness to the colonial relations which ill-treated, deprived of power, and made anonymous so many people and concealed so many historical practices and events?" End of quote. The theoretical frameworks for my study was built upon the concept of global modernity as coloniality, developed by the theorists of the so-called decolonial option theory, including Walter Mignolo, Nelson Maldonado Torres, Madina Tlostanova, and others. An important aspect of the concept was a clear distinction between colonialism as a concrete historical phenomenon and coloniality as a pattern of power or knowledge, production and distribution rooted in colonialism, but transgressing its limits both temporarily and geographically. As Maldonado Torres wrote yet in 2007, I quote, "As modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day." End of quote. Coloniality is constitutive core of Western modernity. It rests, to use vocabulary of Maldonado Torres, upon a metaphysical catastrophe of splitting humanity into human proper and subhuman. This split laid the grounds for the colonial violence of colonialism and Holocaust, and it reiterates itself today in hidden structures, asymmetrical structures of power and knowledge, permitting minds of both oppressing and oppressed. Decolonization of culture, and particularly of museums, aims to discern these asymmetrical patterns, undermine and subvert them to open up for a possibility of new relations between people and peoples. To explore the decolonial turn in European museums, the concept of a decolonial disposition was cast to denote a dynamic state of an individual museum's sensitivity, skill, and motivation for discerning, questioning, and countering the colonial frameworks within museums' own discourse and practice, as well as in a broader cultural context. A museum's decolonial disposition reveals itself in current choices of themes, formats, vocabularies, personnel, and partnership policies. The study of decolonial dispositions of European museums may help to better see and understand decolonial turn in Ukrainian museums. It seemed interesting and productive to involve museums having different historical entanglements with colonialism. Thus, German, Swiss, and Polish museums of non-European, primarily Islamic and Asian heritage, were selected for the study. Though initially 10 museums were studied, data on 6 museums were sufficiently gathered and processed to be included into the final report. These 6 museums are listed on the slide. You can see them. It's Museum für Islamische Kunst in Berlin, Museum für Kunst und Gewerbe Hamburg, Museum Rudyk in Zürich, Museum d'Ethnographie de Genève in Switzerland, Muzeum Азії і Пацифіку імені Анджея Вавжирняка в Варшаві, Muzeum Narodowe w Warszawie. The main method of data collecting was in-depth interviews with museum managers, curators, and educators, conducted in person and based on a special questionnaire. Important data were also retrieved from recent publications authored both by the museums and by outside authors. Each museum case was individually analyzed and a museum report compiled. Comparative analysis of the individual reports allowed to make up the list of 3 key areas and 20 aspects or markers of a museum decolonial disposition. Let's quickly go through this list by areas. The area of discourse. This area includes, in my study, includes the following markers or aspects of decolonial disposition. Museum publicly declares decolonization as its mission, value, and a strategic goal. Part of the museum's team recognizes decolonization as a value and a task. The governing body of the museum declares decolonization as value and strategic goal. Museum takes active part in professional and public discussion on decolonization. Museum uses decolonial vocabulary in its communication with public. Museum uses decolonial vocabulary in its professional communication. The second area is area of self-reflection, and it features the following aspects and markers. Museum acknowledges links between its history and the history of colonialism and its legacy. Museum works on a long-term research program on its critical history. Museum offers permanent or long-term exhibition on its critical history. Museum introduces critical narratives into its public programs. Museum co-produces knowledge by platforming non-museum perspective and voices. Museum collaborates with contemporary artists as agents of critique and decolonization. And the third area is an area of ethics of justice. Museum provides open access to the collection, including full data on its provenance. Museum negotiates access to information on collection with the communities of origin. Museum supports open discussion about collections ownership. Museum engages communities of origin in research and handling of collections. Museum engages and platforms communities of origin in its public programs. Museum participates in procedures fostering restitution of museum collections. Museum implements principles of diversity in its personnel and partnership policies. Museum questions and fights lingering inequality of gender, age, ability, well-being, life, species, etc. The summary chart. This is the final summary chart of the study, shows decolonial dispositions of all 6 museums, allowing to observe some broader trends. While museums of the same region and collection profile may feature different decolonial dispositions, they at the same time share some interesting common traits of discourse, practice, and dynamics of transformation along the lines of historical context, administrative statuses, collection profiles, etc. Let's look at some cases. Speaking about the difference in cultural and museological context, we can think of Germany, one of the former Western colonial empires that lost its colonies as a result of the defeat in the First World War, and that afterwards gained even greater imperial ambitions. The defeat in the Second World War, instead, contributed to the long, complex, and profound reflection of Germans the eventual confession of guilt and further atonement for the crimes of genocide, exploitation, and plunder. One of the consequences of the experience might have been the greater readiness of the German intellectuals and society in general to critical introspection in regard of colonial history and lingering coloniality. It was first time in Germany in 2018 that the problematic status of cultural heritage from the colonial context was acknowledged publicly by the government, and the museum community worked out a policy document on the key ethical and theoretical foundations as well as practical guidelines in the field of decolonization of museums of non-European cultural heritage. Here on the slide you see the cover of the third final edition of these guidelines policy documents. Unlike Germany, Switzerland didn't formally possess colonial territories. However, historical studies inform that Swiss soldiers were fighting in the Western colonies and Swiss companies made money out of slavery and as investors and traders. Swiss collectors benefited from the Western market of non-European antiquities. Therefore, many collections of Swiss museums came from colonial contexts and maintained colonial power and knowledge structures just as much as museums of former empires. The boom of academic research on Switzerland's historical entanglements with colonialism prompted changes in museums. As early as in 2003, when 18 oldest and largest European museums collectively signed the infamous Declaration on the Importance and Value of Universal Museums, trying to protect the legitimacy and morality of their possessions from the colonial contexts, the Museum of Ethnography of Neuchâtel presented a public project, Le Musée Cannibal, focused on, I quote, the cannibalistic desire to feed on others, a desire which originally led to the creation and development of museums of ethnography. The collections of ethnographic museums made up of vast numbers of objects acquired over a long period of time through expeditions in the field bear witness to the desire to incorporate what is different or other. On the slide, you see a picture from the exhibition of this project, where museum items, museum exhibits, museum collection objects are wrapped in foam and are stored as if in the refrigerator as food. Noteworthy, the key Swiss museums of non-European heritage have always been local, city or cantonal museums enjoying a larger political autonomy than some of their German and Polish colleagues, bearing statuses of a national or state museums. Complex social issues are much easier to solve within the framework of a simpler political system. So in 2022, the city of Geneva authorized an official policy document, the guidelines on work with collections from the colonial context, introduced by the Museum of Ethnography of Geneva. Among other important parts, this document provided the cause of restitution with a clear, simplified procedure, based in the first place on the museum research and expertise. You can see the cover of this unique, legitimate document on the collection management policy concerning museum collections from the colonial context on this slide. Poland has also had no overseas colonies, and it was never a classical colonial empire. At the same time, being a kind of an internal colony of the Russian Empire in the 19th, early 20th century, Poland itself maintained asymmetrical relations with Ukrainian and other minorities population in its eastern territories. Colonial aspirations of Poles in Africa in the interwar period were followed by periods of humiliation of Poland by Germany during the Second World War and by the Soviet Union in the post-war decades that had fueled Polish imagination of victimhood and exceptionalism. Against the backdrop of this imagination, any narratives on Poland as a dominating white culture or polity, either in the history of Krasie or Eastern territories, or in its attitude to the contemporary migrant minorities in Polish cities, gained little popularity in the society. the region obsessed with its own history but reluctant to critically examine it. That is how Polish cultural critics describe Poland today. Poland's main museum, the National Museum in Warsaw, boasts of the world's most valuable collection of Nubian art, taken by Polish archaeologists from Sudan in the 1960s. Scholars' critical remarks about the problematic character of this transfer, of its provenance, are being ignored. Post-Polish and Swiss complex non-classical site-specific coloniality of non-European heritage museums could serve as subject of comparison with Ukrainian museums of this kind. The modern Western typology of non-European heritage collection, clearly dividing them into the so-called art museums and ethnography museums, have been long reproducing the colonial geography of the world with its clear hierarchy of cultures. Africa, Latin America, Australia, and Oceania, as well as some regions and cultures of Asia, were, according to the logic of Western colonial mind, incapable of creating proper art, so their cultural heritage was relegated to the realm of ethnography and entailed in the ethnographic museums. The summary chart data supported the already discussed observation that the so-called ethnological or ethnographical museums are generally more prone to self-critical discourse and taking over guilt for the crimes of robbery, exploitation, genocide, etc., committed by the West against non-European cultures. There is a range of factors that fed into this greater focus on the historical and social justice, like, for instance, increasingly disclosed in its detailed direct connectedness of a museum's history with the history of colonialism and its crimes, the growing number of restitution claims from the communities of collections origin, supported by the scanty criticism from the community's allies in the West, academic and political activists. Transnational museum initiatives like the Heidelberg Statement of 2019 or the Zurich Declaration of 2024, both documents signed by the majority of ethnographic museums in German-speaking Europe, confirmed readiness of museums to contribute to decolonizing knowledge, heritage, and intercultural relations in the current, I quote, in the current era of crisis and rising nationalism. Noteworthy that nothing of this kind of movement is observed for European art museums. In the beginning of the 20th century, Western scholarship and museums have acquitted part of the Islamic and East Asian heritage for its aesthetic quality and value status with Europe's own heritage, and granted it the definition of art. The professional and public discourse was shaped, and numerous museums of Islamic and Asian art were established throughout the Western world. Our study has shown that decolonial discourses of the art museums, stimulated greatly by academic scholarship, are built not that much upon the ethical values of justice and solidarity, but rather upon the epistemological values of historical accuracy of collections' provenance data and the idea of overcoming the limitations of Western epistemology and aesthetics by, I quote, unearthing radically different holistic episteme of knowledge, the so-called decolonial aesthesis, embedded in dislocated objects and accessible only to the bearers of this particular culture. Thus, inviting a curator from outside the West to develop a concept and create a presentation seems to be the most promising strategy that Western museums of non-European art can today opt for. While all respondents of the interviews agreed that critical study of collections history and public transparency of its results were moral obligations of museums, none of the 6 museums under scrutiny had, as of 2023, a clear, let alone implemented, concept of how to present post-colonial history of collections in a permanent or representational format. It was the post-colonial intervention into a conventional permanent exhibition that by that moment became the most popular format of curating debated provenance. 3 museums of the pool have already launched projects of post-colonial interventions, and one more museum was planning to do that. All these interventions were structured in a similar way as a trail laid out in the space of the old permanent gallery. The trail was supposed to lead visitors from one thematic point to another, and each stop was accompanied by curators' commentaries about the historical context of provenance, including those related to the injustice and violence of the colonial era and its lingering legacy. A peculiar feature of the intervention, called establishing a dialogue in the Museum of Ethnography in Geneva, was that it tracked not only objects per se, but also the voids left in the gallery after the removal of objects, either hidden after being claimed by the source communities as unshowable or already restituted. These voids spoke even more eloquently in their critique of the ethical order of the surrounding conventional ethnographic exhibition than any discursive commentary. Placed in the midst of colonial display objectifying sacred entities of other cultures, the dialogue trail reflected the present duality of a Western museum mind, when it is no longer external actors like communities of origin, political activists, or academic scholars pushed museums to self-reflection and change, but a museum itself, a curator themselves, having developed this self-critical position and empathy towards communities from the underside of colonial difference, became their own rigorous investigator. The eloquence of voids in the Geneva Museum fosters thinking that the healing of the catastrophic split of a Western museum mind is only possible through the loss of the material heritage, or the loss of power over its discourse, or of both. The identity crisis imbued in the post-colonial interventions into colonial galleries prompted many Western museums of non-European art to seek for resolutions through platforming knowledge of non-European actors. Instead of the ego conqueror of the modern Western mind with its virtues of self-centeredness and self-extension, the new stance of self-restraint and radical humbleness is appearing and voicing itself as both a moral and an intellectual virtue. These new virtues, subverting the core stances of modernity, require considerable determination and courage from museums and museum professionals, more so in one European societies than in others. Following these some of results and observations on Western museums, I would like now to discuss certain aspects of decolonization of culture in Ukraine, and particularly in Ukrainian museums. The global museum decolonial turn still remains little known and poorly understood in Ukraine, due to the long history of forced disconnection of Ukrainian culture from the global evolution of ideas and policies in the field of heritage. Introduced in the sub-imperial period of Ukrainian history, this disconnection was reinforced in the 1930s by the Soviet policy of informational isolation and cultural devastation of Ukraine, and continued well into the post-Soviet period. Until recent years, even most advanced Ukrainian museums have been primarily preoccupied with accelerated revision of collections definitions, rebuilding public services, and fundraising. The task of deeper rethinking the museum's semantic and ethical premises was largely overlooked. However, the Russian war, and especially the full-scale invasion unleashed by Russia in February 2022, prompted Ukraine to rethink the task of culture in the face of direct existential threat. The war stimulated the Ukrainian decolonial discourse. The very word decolonization quickly became a widespread concept, having replaced the older notions of de-Russification, decommunization, and others in addressing the tasks of, I quote here the official document of Ministry of Culture, overcoming the anti-Ukrainian influence of Russian civilizational myths, the legacy of Russian imperialism and Soviet totalitarianism in the public space of Ukrainian cities and towns, end of quote. Many public activities have been addressing Russian and Soviet oppression of Ukrainian culture by reclaiming Ukrainian identity of prominent cultural figures appropriated by Russia, or removing toponyms and monuments associated with the Russian and Soviet cultures and histories from the public spaces. The long-established messages of Ukrainian museums shaped within imperial and particularly Soviet political contexts have been revisited. At the same time, the aspects of discourse shaped within the larger context of Western modernity were left intact. Among reasons to it was the urgency of pro-Western political and cultural agenda of the ongoing war. In the last wartime decade, the concept of frontierness, or the recently coined multi-frontierness, rendering the boundary nature of Ukraine's historical and cultural positionality, has become one of the key words describing Ukrainian identity. The status of the border between big geo-economic and civilizational systems implied the continuing liminality of life, prompting Ukrainians to incorporate, adopt and adapt, navigate, negotiate and hybridize multiple identities and semantic orders. The fundamental hybridity of Ukrainian coloniality was discussed yet in the post-Second World War period by Ukrainian historian Ivan Lysak-Rudnitsky, pointing to Ukraine's twofold position within Russian imperial and Soviet orders as both a subaltern nation resisting colonial oppression and the part of the imperial European core. Related to the second role is Ukraine's largely unconscious and unspoken whiteness, rooted in the long history of West-centrism. Since the early modernity, Ukrainian elites were educated as part of the Western civilization, and the Western knowledge was perceived in Ukraine as normative and exemplary. The same way, the Ukrainian museums were cast after the Western models, either directly or through the mediation of Russian and Soviet culture, themselves rooted in the Western epistemic grounds. Thus, without being a formal colonizer, Ukraine developed museums which missions, collections, and modes of presentation reflected and retranslated modern Western white Christian perspective on other, non-European cultures. Let's take a brief look at the case of the Khanenko Museum in Kyiv, the museum believed to keep the richest national collection of world arts in Ukraine. The museum was established in 1919 as an embodiment of the idea of Bohdan and Varvara Khanenko's prominent Ukrainian collectors and actors of culture. The Khanenko's collection, assembled during the last decades of the 90s and first decades of the 20th centuries, predominantly in the European art market, laid the foundation of the museum holdings. During the 20th and the early 21st centuries, the collection was replenished from various sources, and at the same time, there were huge losses, particularly on the turn of the 1930s and during the Second World War. Ukraine's major national museum of world art, the Khanenko Museum has been until 2022 among leaders in the areas of collection research, social programming, and accessibility. However, despite this fairly progressive access, from 2006 to 2022, the museum also had human skull on display, presented as a piece of art with commentary that fitted more for a non-human object. Let's imagine for a moment the skull of some familiar person. For instance, our colleague, or our own skull, carefully cleaned and skillfully decorated, on display in the Khanenko Museum window. This is unthinkable. We cannot do anything like that to a person's dignity or memory. However, the mentioned skull did never raise any questions and doubts. Why? Our answer is that the human remains in the showcase belong to someone perceived outside the concept of a proper human being, the concept we mean when saying, I am human. One of the aspects of this exclusion from the concept of humanity was that it was absolutely okay to know almost nothing about the owner of the skull. No name, no personal history, only a roughly defined time of life, 18th century, and geography, Tibet. This void of knowledge rendered this person invisible, almost absent. The dehumanizing presentation of the skull left silent not only the person whose bodily remains occurred in the showcase. Speaking about the Tibetan Kapala or Gabala ritual bowl, the museum didn't think to mention many people who had a direct, deep, and meaningful connection with the skull. The master artist who transformed it in a bowl, the Buddhist priest who sanctified the Kapala as a sacred entity and introduced it into the ritual, people witnessing the transfer of the sacred entity of Tibetan culture from its original context to a new, different cultural context, a desacralizing, thus sacrilegious act. Names, stories, and feelings of all these people were unimportant to be noted and remembered. They were erased from the history because of the power hierarchy of people, communities, and cultures defining who and what was important. Instead, the names and lives of people who discovered, explored, enlightened, civilized, who acquired, collected, and moved heritage values across geographical and cultural contexts, who recorded sacred entities as curiosities, goods, artworks, etc., remained important for our memory. In the history of the Khanenko Museum, these latter people were all white Europeans, mostly men, and their names, Kozlov, Lichko, Sherbak, Novitsky, etc., have been preserved in the museum's archive and discourse in a halo of glory and gratefulness. The striking inequality between people in the memory of the Ukrainian Museum and more broadly of Ukrainian culture clearly reveals a fundamental epistemic structure of the museum mind existing yet before 2000, the year the human skull entered the museum collection in Kyiv. How the structure has been shaped. The story of the museum started in 1870s, when Bohdan Khanenko, a young lawyer of noble descent, discovered the boundless charms of art of European old masters. The Russian Empire's metropolises, Moscow and St. Petersburg, provided Khanenko with intellectual, aesthetic, and market resources, testifying to what Madina Plastanova called Russia's profound mental and cultural dependency on the West. Khanenko married Varvara Tereshchenko, and they decided to collect art, meaning the Western art. They extensively traveled across Europe, integrating themselves into the Western cultural fabric and accepting the Western knowledge as a reference worthy for unquestioned following. The Khanenko's house in Kyiv, erected at the end of the 1880s, became an irrefutable testament to their deep oath to the West. It spectacularly presented the Western artistic canon, with the interior ensembles tailored in the style of the Gothic, Renaissance, Baroque, Rococo, and the Dutch burgher style of the 17th century. From the same Western cultural milieu of the late 19th century, the Khanenkos borrowed the idea of a universal museum. Their collectors' interests expanded in line with European trends and eventually embraced Islamic art, ancient Egyptian archaeology, and East Asian art. Old photographs of the Khanenko's mansion also featured pieces of Buddhist and Hinduist, Vaishnavite rituals. This is the Italian hall of the Khanenko's mansion, documented presumably in the first years of the 20th century. It features rich collections of old Italian and Ukrainian art, diversified by scattered pieces of Persian ceramics, Turkish textiles, and Chinese bronze and cloisonné articles, intervening into the realm of European aesthetics with their non-canonical visuality. The later picture of the hall, taken around 1910, featured an enlarged Islamic collection presented in a separate window and on the wall around it. Arranged densely in the style of an Oriental bazaar, the objects no longer served a peculiar entourage for European art, but presented a distinct and worthy artistic phenomenon. And still, ordered purely visually, without a regard to material, region, or dating, the Islamic objects seem to present some broadly generalized, ahistorical Islamic Middle Ages. This dilettante's principle of displaying the East survived through 1920s to be replaced only in 1929 by a new separate museum exhibition of Islamic art. The Khanenko's attitude towards non-European heritage could be also read from some telling absences. Having published best parts of their European, Old Rus, and Byzantine collections in catalogues, the Khanenkos issued no single book on their non-European or non-Christian collections. This void was echoed by silence in the Bohdan's memoir. Within nearly 100 pages devoted to the collection's history, Khanenko mentioned an Islamic object only once and didn't say a single word about Asian art. These and other evidences, albeit scanty due to the loss of the Khanenko's archive, provide us with grounds to think that the Western culture and artistic tradition had always remained for the Ukrainian collectors at the top of the hierarchy, and that their project of the Universal Khanenko Museum rested upon a clearly Eurocentric, thus eminently white, worldview. In the 1920s, a new approach to non-European collection was introduced in the museum. The political agenda of economic and cultural integration of the Soviet East into the state and the boom of the Oriental studies, seen as particularly important area of knowledge, prompted the museum to allocate larger resources to its non-European division. The first scientific catalogues and permanent exhibitions of non-European art were developed. You see on the slide the first catalogue of Islamic collection and the first permanent exhibition of a collection of the Middle East. The new discourse on non-European heritage somewhat undermined Khanenko's foundational Eurocentrism by introducing politically driven critical narratives on Western and Russian imperialist policies in the East. At the same time, the museum benefited from the Soviet cultural colonization of its own East by participating in the collecting expeditions of major Soviet museums to Central Asian Caucasus. Hundreds of artisanal objects entered the Khanenko Museum collection in those years, but also some antiquities, including fragments of the architectural decor of the celebrated 16th century Bukhara monuments that is now in Uzbekistan. You can see this fragment, one of these fragments to the left. Seen by the museum as its great achievement in collecting, the dislocated antiquities stand for some new shade of the museum whiteness, no longer rooted in the direct Khanenko's devotional Westcentrism. Rather, it was something about what Lysak Rudnitsky meant by Ukraine's being a part of the Soviet European core in relation to the Soviet non-European subjects. Significantly, in the same period of 1928-1931, when the museum scholar Maria Vizmitina brought 16th century piece from Bukhara to Kyiv, she was passionately, though unsuccessfully, fighting for Persian rarities that were forcibly removed from the Khanenko Museum by the Soviet political decisions. Among other highlights of the Khanenko's collection was the unique Persian aquamanila in the form of a cow, dating 1206. You can see it to the right. Taken from Kyiv to be later given to the collection of the Hermitage, the Soviet Metropolitan Museum. This duality of roles that museum performed as both a victim and a beneficiary of Soviet colonial policies mirrors the structural black and white hybridity of Ukrainian coloniality. In the mid-1930s, due to political repressions against Ukrainian humanitarian science, the museum exhibition of non-European art was closed and the researchers were fired. During the Second World War, the lion's share of the Eastern collection was left under occupation and looted by Nazis. As the inventories on this part of collection were never kept properly, and some of them were occasionally lost, it was impossible, and it is still impossible, to report the war losses accurately. The iron curtain that further distanced Ukrainian culture and science from the rest of the world was another key reason of stagnation that lasted in the museum until the mid-1990s. At this time, the Hermitage Museum and the Museum of Oriental Art in Moscow became almost exclusive sources of knowledge for Kyiv Museum, with luminaries from these museums regularly visiting Kyiv to provide scientific emergency aid. This aid took the form of revisited object definitions added to the museum's inventories, oftentimes without any argumentation, thus turning the museum knowledge on its non-European collection into wasteland. During this period, the Khanenko Museum whiteness got further reinforced. Already in the 1930s, the European art regained its initial position as a core collection. Considered more prestigious by the museum team itself, these three separate European departments of painting, prints, and applied arts enjoyed privileges over the single and always understaffed Eastern department. European collection received the lion's share of researchers' attention, exhibition space, funding, and publishing resources. The museum building kept promoting values of Western culture through its unique and exquisite architecture, while Islamic and Asian collections huddled in the modest rear rooms. Orientalized by both Western and Soviet paradigms of knowledge and marginalized within the museum's own operating system, the non-European collections experienced a double discrimination. There is no surprise that the short name, the Western Museum, applied to the Khanenko Museum by Nazi in the 1940s, has remained in use of Kyivites until very recently. In 1990s, when the Iron Curtain finally lifted, the Ukrainian museums regained access to the Western scholarship and global scholarship, but again, mostly Western scholarship. The huge gap of knowledge on collections prompted the Khanenko Museum to strive to bridge it ASAP, and the grand marathon of hectic absorption of information missed over the decades of isolation began. In fact, the Hermitage was replaced by the Louvre and the Metropolitan Museums and other grand museums. The lavish catalogues of these and other major Western museums served as a handy source of information, while academic research, which is narrowly focused and imbued with scholarly self-reflection, and thus much more time and attention consuming, were often left out. This latest wave of epistemic Westcentrism in the Khanenko Museum history organically correlated with the political Westcentrism of a part of Ukrainian society which grew from the Orange Revolution of 2004 to Euromaidan of 2013 and to the anti-terrorist operation in Russian-occupied Eastern Ukraine in 2014. In this situation, the global decolonial West critical discourse was simply not read as relevant in Ukraine. This insensitivity was structural for all spheres of Ukrainian culture, including secondary and higher education curricula, gaping the history of non-European cultures, colonialism, and decolonization. In addition, unlike many museums in the West, Ukrainian museums and schools have not experienced any criticism or pressure from either academia or civil society in these aspects. Wrapping up the Ukrainian part of my talk, I would like to repeat that the ongoing war unleashed by Russia against Ukraine prompted Ukrainian culture to rethinking and re-articulation itself in the global discourse, long dominated by the Russian voice. However, processing Ukrainian experience only from the perspective of a victim of colonial oppression neglects other important aspects like the imminent whiteness of Ukrainian culture and museums internalized following the discourse of Western modernity. To keep uncritically reproducing this discourse today looks counterproductive for Ukraine from both moral and strategic perspectives. Not calling for a simplistic West critical turn, I suggest that Ukrainian museum curators and educators explore and attempt to apply a wide critical perspective by expanding their interests and their expertise in the area of pre-modern and modern history of non-European societies. South doesn't speak East and East not South. This observation made by David Kionimo, American scholar yet in 2001, is still very true for Ukraine. It is time to break this silence to access the richness of knowledge and energy of solidarity that the non-European part of the world can offer Ukraine. One of the steps in this direction that the Khanenko Museum is going to make already this fall is an exhibition project Africa Direct. About 50 heritage items from African cultures belonging to the museum and several private collections in Ukraine will be presented in the European halls of the Khanenko Museum, commented by the heritage experts from Africa and accompanied by works on contemporary artists of African background. By listening to Africa, we hope to learn to sensitively speak it. I'm thanking you deeply for your kindest attention.